I have told this story 3 times. Once to the station commander, once to the interspecies liaison office on Meridian, and once to a journalist who never published it because she said no one would believe it. I will tell it a 4th time here, and I will not embellish it. There is nothing in it that requires embellishment. My name is Davin Holt. In the autumn of the 43rd year of the Corridor Compact, I was 31 years old and employed as a Level 2 maintenance technician aboard Waystation Care of 9, a mid-tier freight hub positioned at the junction of 3 shipping lanes on what most people politely called the fringe, and what the people who worked there called the back end of nowhere. The station handled about 40,000 tons of cargo per standard rotation, housed a permanent crew of roughly 600, and processed transient populations that swelled to 3,000 or 4,000 during peak freight cycles. It smelled like recycled air, machine lubricant, and the particular institutional despair of a place that exists to serve other places rather than itself. I had been there 4 years. I ran the tertiary maintenance loop on Deck 7 through Deck 11, which meant I fixed air scrubbers, replaced filtration packs, patched conduit insulation, and unclogged whatever needed unclogging on the lower half of the station's non-commercial infrastructure. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that a station notices only when it stops being done. I was good at it. I was punctual. I did not cause trouble. I had a small cabin on Deck 8. A coffee maker that I had repaired 6 times, and a set of tools I had bought with my own money because the station-issue kit was garbage. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand what kind of man was alone in Maintenance Junction, 11 Foxtrot on the night shift of the 14th of October, when the Veth'kai cubs crawled out of the conduit access panel and collapsed on the floor in front of me. Not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a xenobiologist, a maintenance technician with a torque wrench in one hand and a diagnostic tablet in the other, scheduled to replace a cracked filtration housing and be back in his cabin by 300. The Veth'kai, I will describe them as they are, not as the popular fear of them suggests. They are large, adults run between 2 and 2.5 meters at the shoulder when on all fours, which is their natural locomotion, though they can stand and frequently do for purposes of threat display or social communication. Their bodies are lean in the way that apex predators are lean, no excess, all function. Their fur is a deep gray-black that shifts toward blue under certain lighting conditions, and along their spines and flanks they carry a secondary layer of bioluminescent filaments, thin, almost hair-like structures that glow when the animal is in an agitated state. In combat readiness, a Veth'kai's filaments run hot orange. In full aggression they go white. I have seen both. I have also seen them go completely dark, which happens in exactly one emotional state, and I will get to that. Their social structure is absolute. The pack is the unit of survival, of identity, of moral authority. There is nothing outside the pack that matters to a Veth'kai in any meaningful sense. Non-pack life exists in one of 2 categories, threat or resource. Occasionally, on extended analysis, a non-pack entity might be elevated to the 3rd category, acknowledged, which means you are neither food nor enemy but simply present, like a rock or a vent shaft. It is not warmth. It is not friendship. It is the cognitive equivalent of a filing cabinet drawer labeled neutral. To be acknowledged by a Veth'kai is the diplomatic equivalent of a handshake, and it had taken the Corridor Compact 40 years of careful, costly negotiation to achieve even that much with the 3 packs that operated in our transit corridor. I did not know most of this on the night in question. I knew what every station worker knew. Stay clear of Veth'kai transit zones. Do not make direct eye contact with adults. Do not make sudden movements around cubs. And if you hear the filament buzz, that means an adult is running hot. You get yourself behind a bulkhead door and you seal it. The compact had protocols. The protocols had kept the fringe stations more or less intact for a generation. I had followed them for 4 years without incident. The cubs came out of the conduit at 1:47. There were 2 of them. I found out later they were littermates, hatched the same season, which made them somewhere between 8 and 14 months old in Veth'kai terms, equivalent, the xenobiologists told me afterward, to roughly 4 or 5 years in human development. Old enough to move on their own, young enough to be catastrophically stupid about where they went. They were maybe 60 centimeters at the shoulder. Their bioluminescent filaments had not fully developed yet, just a faint smear of dim blue along the spine, like a bruise under dark skin. Their fur was slightly paler than adult Veth'kai, the way young things often are before the full pigment settles in. They moved wrong, not the fluid, terrifying efficiency of adults, but the stumbling, overcorrecting scramble of animals that had not quite figured out where all their limbs went yet. They collapsed because they were hurt. The one on the left had a laceration along its right flank, not deep, but ragged, the kind of wound you get from scraping through a metal conduit at speed for a long distance. The one on the right was worse. It had a section of insulation wrap tangled around its left foreleg, cutting off circulation, and the limb below the wrap had gone swollen and dark. It hit the floor and did not try to get up. It just lay there, breathing in short, shallow pulls, its filaments barely flickering. I stood there for approximately 4 seconds, which felt much longer. Every piece of training I had said, do not approach, do not engage, contact station security, stand clear, wait for someone qualified to handle this. The Veth'kai pack transiting through Care of 9 that rotation were on Deck 4, that was their registered zone, their designated transit area, safely removed from my maintenance loop by 7 decks and 4 bulkhead stations. How these two had gotten into the Deck 11 conduit system was a question for someone else. My job was to back up, call it in, and stay out of the way. I called it in. I keyed my comm and reported 2 Veth'kai cubs, apparent distress, Junction 11 Foxtrot. The duty officer acknowledged and said a security team would respond. Estimated response time, 22 minutes. Standard fringe station staffing on a night shift, 2 security personnel actually mobile, the rest monitoring. 22 minutes. I looked at the cub with the wrap on its leg. It looked back at me. Its eyes were amber in the adult, but in the young the amber has not fully saturated yet, and what looked back at me was closer to gold, pale, enormous, dilated in the low-maintenance lighting. It made a sound, not the clicking threat vocalization I knew to recognize from training, something quieter, something that had no formal entry in any of the station's alien contact protocols. I am a maintenance technician. I know what a living thing looks like when it is frightened and in pain, because I have been frightened and in pain, and the physical grammar of it, the shallow breathing, the held still quality, the eyes that are too wide and watching everything at once, that grammar does not have a species. It is older than species. I set down my torque wrench. I set down my diagnostic tablet. I crouched slowly to make myself smaller, and I stayed there at the edge of the cub's vision while I thought about what I was doing. The wrap on its leg was standard conduit insulation, the kind I handled every shift. It had a release clasp. The clasp was designed to open with a quarter turn of a standard flathead, which I had on my belt. The wound on the other one was not life-threatening on its own, but in a young animal, blood loss and distress together are a compounding problem. I'm going to be honest about the decision I made next, because there is a version of this story where I am calm and certain and noble, and that version is not true. What happened is that I sat there for another minute and a half in a very cold maintenance junction with 2 injured alien cubs staring at me, and I felt terrible. Not heroic. Terrible, in the specific way that you feel terrible when something small is hurting, and you are the only thing present that has the means to help it. It is not a glorious feeling. It is closer to a kind of low, grinding obligation, the same feeling that makes you stop your vehicle for an animal on the road even when you are running late. I moved toward the one with the wrap. I want to be honest about something else. In the minute and a half I spent sitting there deciding, I thought about the regulations. I thought about them seriously, the way you think about regulations when you have followed them long enough that they feel structural, not rules you consult but load-bearing assumptions about how situations work. The regulations said, "Do not approach." They said it for good reasons. A panicked Veth'kai cub will bite, and a bite from even a young one is significant, and a bite from a young one whose adult pack is somewhere on this station, in an already heightened state, has diplomatic implications that go well past the medical ones. The regulations were not wrong. They had been written by people who understood what they were protecting. But the cub with the wrapped leg was looking at me, and the swelling below the wrap was the color of a bad bruise, and the regulation that said "do not approach" and the fact of the swelling existed simultaneously in my head, and I could not make them resolve into a clean answer. Some situations do not resolve cleanly. Some situations give you the bad option and the slightly less bad option and no third door. I chose. I moved. I moved slowly. I kept my hands visible. I talked, not because I thought it would understand the words. Veth'kai language and human language share approximately nothing in common, but because my voice was the only soft, non-threatening signal I had available, and the sound of a calm human voice at low volume does something to a frightened creature regardless of species. This is also not heroism. It is just a thing that is true. The cub with the wrap let me get close. It flinched when I touched the insulation, but it did not bite. Maybe it was too weak. Maybe some part of whatever Veth'kai cubs are born knowing recognized that I was attempting something other than harm. I do not know. I turned the clasp a quarter turn and the wrap came free, and I moved it away from the leg very carefully, and the cub made that sound again, the one that had no entry in the protocols, but it did not try to move away. The leg was in bad shape. The swelling was significant. I was not a medical technician, and I did not have anything in my kit that would address the circulation damage. What I had was a clean pressure cloth from the first aid pouch on my belt, and I wrapped the leg as well as I knew how to wrap it, which was not perfectly, but better than the insulation had been. The cub bore this with a kind of exhausted patience that told me it was running very low on everything. When I finished with the leg, I looked at the other one. The flank wound was not going to kill it, but it needed cleaning and closing, and I did not have the means for that either. What I could do was apply pressure and keep it warm, because the junction was cold. Maintenance junctions on Deck 11 run a few degrees below general station temperature, because of the proximity to the outer hull, and small animals losing blood in cold environments is a straightforward problem with a straightforward answer. I sat down on the floor. In a cold maintenance junction, at 200 on a Tuesday, I sat down on the deck plating with my back against a conduit housing, and I picked up the cub with the flank wound slowly, hands visible, talking quietly the whole time, and I put it against my chest and held it there with one hand applying pressure to the wound through the pressure cloth and the other arm around it, because I needed both hands to keep it still and warm at once. It tried once to pull away, not hard. After about 30 seconds it stopped trying and went still against me. Its breathing was still shallow, but it was breathing. I could feel its heartbeat very fast against my chest. The other one, the one with the wrapped leg, dragged itself over the deck toward me with the 3 functioning legs it had available and collapsed against my hip. I'm not going to tell you it was a sweet moment, because I was terrified and my comm was going off every few minutes with the duty officer asking for status updates, and the junction was cold and the deck was hard, and the cub against my chest smelled like metal and something I had no word for. But it was a moment. The cub against my hip put its head down on my thigh, and its filaments went dim, the way they do when an animal is too depleted to run hot, and it breathed, and I breathed. I said over comm that the cubs were stable for now, and I was keeping them warm until security arrived. There was a pause. The duty officer said, "Holt, are you holding them?" I said affirmative. There was another pause longer. Then, understood. Security ETA is now 12 minutes. Holt, do not move from your current position. Do not alarm the cubs. We are treating this as a priority contact situation. I said understood. What I did not know at that moment, what no one on comm told me, possibly because no one on the night shift knew to tell me, was that the pack had already noticed the cubs were missing. The Veth'kai Alpha had reported the absence to the Deck 4 contact officer 17 minutes earlier. The station was already in the early stages of a priority alert. The reason the duty officer's voice had shifted into a very careful register was not just concern for the cubs. It was that a Veth'kai pack actively searching for missing young is one of the most dangerous situations a space station can face. And at the moment of our conversation, that pack was moving. Veth'kai do not file transit requests when their cubs are missing. I felt the vibration before I heard anything. A deep, subsonic thrum that I initially mistook for a pressure fluctuation in the conduit system, because I was a maintenance technician and pressure fluctuations were my frame of reference. It took me a moment to understand that the vibration was biological in origin. The pack communication frequency, the subsonic channel that used to coordinate over distances that would defeat any vocalization. They had located the cubs' scent trail. They were coming down. The junction had one entrance, the primary maintenance access from the Deck 11 corridor, a standard 6-panel bulkhead door currently standing open because I had propped it open when I arrived to allow for equipment transit. Standard procedure on a maintenance run. Protocol said bulkhead doors in Veth'kai adjacent zones were to be sealed if a contact situation developed. I had a contact situation. The door was open. If I moved to seal it, I would have to set the cubs down. I did not set the cubs down. I understand that this is the moment in the story where someone always asks, why? Why not seal the door? Why not create the barrier between yourself and a pack of apex predators coming in hot? And the answer is that the cub on my chest had gone very quiet and very still in a way I did not like, and the cub against my hip was barely conscious. And if I moved them or set them down or created any significant disruption in that moment, I was genuinely uncertain they would come through it. The one on my chest was the worst of the two, and I had one hand on its wound, and that hand was doing something. I could feel it. So I sat there. The security team did not make it. 12 minutes had been an estimate, and what actually happened was that the Veth'kai pack hit the Deck 9, 11 access corridor in significantly less than 12 minutes. Because when a Veth'kai pack is moving toward its young, it does not observe speed restrictions, and the two security personnel who attempted to intercept them were very brave and also very wise. They backed against the wall, sealed themselves behind a maintenance alcove panel, and watched the pack go past. This I found out later. At the time, all I knew was that my comm went very loud for about 30 seconds, and then went very quiet. And then I heard them. They were not loud. I think people expect apex predators to be loud when they are closing on something, and sometimes they are the filament buzz, the threat vocalization, those are loud. But when a Veth'kai pack is hunting, the primary movement mode is almost completely silent. What I heard first was the change in the air pressure as something large moved through the corridor outside the open door. A subtle displacement. The kind of thing a maintenance technician learns to notice. Because in conduit systems, it usually means a fan is about to fail. Then the filament light came through the door ahead of anything else. Orange, all of them running orange, which meant combat ready, which meant they had a target and they were committed. The light swept the junction in pulses, not quite steady, the way agitated bioluminescence never quite steadies, and it found me sitting on the floor with my back against the conduit housing and two cubs stacked against me like sandbags. I counted 7 adults. The alpha came through the door last. And I knew it was the alpha not because of size, though the alpha was the largest, but because of the way the other 6 stepped aside to give it the clear line of sight. Every Veth'kai in that room was looking at me. 7 pairs of amber eyes, filaments going orange hot, the subsonic thrum filling the junction at a frequency I felt in my back teeth. I did not move. I want to be very precise about why I did not move, because it was not courage. Courage is when you feel fear and choose action anyway. What I felt in that moment was a very specific species of stillness that is not courage and not calm, but simply the body's understanding that any action available to it is worse than no action at all. I had nowhere to go. I had nothing I could do with my hands except what I was already doing. So I stayed still. The alpha moved toward me. It came slowly, which I would later learn is not the speed of hesitation, but the speed of assessment. A Veth'kai alpha approaching a potential threat it has not yet categorized. The filaments ran hot orange, and the amber eyes were on me, and the subsonic thrum went up slightly in frequency, which means something in Veth'kai communication that the xenobiologists have 17 different theories about and no consensus. I kept my hands still. I kept my breathing even, or as even as I could manage, which was not very even. There is a particular quality to being assessed by a large predator, not the blunt, adrenaline-flooded terror of being attacked, which is a fast thing, over quickly one way or another, but the slower, more sustained experience of being evaluated, of being looked at hard, the way a thing that has survived by reading other things correctly looks at something new. The alpha's eyes moved across me in segments. Hands first, then face, then the cubs, then hands again. It was doing what all serious predators do in ambiguous situations. It was gathering information before committing, because commitment in the wrong direction is expensive, and this alpha had not got to alpha by spending its resources wrong. I met its eyes for one moment and then looked away at the cub on my chest. Not because I knew that was the right thing to do, because I could not hold the alpha's gaze and also keep my hands steady, and keeping my hands steady mattered more. It stopped about 2 meters away. I watched it look at me. I watched it look at the cubs, at the one on my chest, at the one against my hip. I watched something happen in the filaments, not a dramatic shift, not the white of full aggression. The orange began to quiet, not to the neutral gray of rest. Somewhere in between, a color I had no name for, that I still have no name for, that I have described to xenobiologists 4 separate times and received 4 different proposed classifications for. The alpha made a sound, not the subsonic thrum, a vocalization mid-range with a falling cadence. Around the room, the other 6 adults' filaments shifted with it, not in unison, a ripple, one to the next like the color moving through them as information. The alpha did something then that I have thought about every day since. It sat down. Not collapsed, not retreated, not postured. It sat. A deliberate movement, weight shifted back onto haunches, forelegs folded, in the posture that I was told later the Veth'kai use within a pack for what translates roughly as the held moment, the pause before a decision, the in-between state. It looked at me, I looked at it. The cub on my chest made a sound, the same sound it had made when I was working on the other one's leg. Quiet, that quality without protocol entry. And I felt the alpha's focus on that sound the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Not dramatic, absolute. I said quietly to no one and everyone, they were hurt. I was trying to keep them warm until someone came. The alpha did not understand those words, but it was looking at my hands, at the hand on the wound, at the way I was holding the cub, and in the Veth'kai framework of behavioral reading, hands tell you everything. What a creature does with its hands when it is in contact with a young animal tells you more than anything it might vocalize. I have learned this since. On that night, I only knew that I should keep my hands where they were and keep doing what I was doing, and so I did. The alpha stayed sitting for a long time. I do not have a precise count. It felt like the better part of forever. At some point during that wait, a third cub materialized from behind the alpha, smaller, moving cautiously, and positioned itself at the alpha's flank, watching me with the same wide gold eyes I had been watching for the last hour. A third cub. One that had not been in the conduit, one that had come down with the pack. It sniffed in my direction, made no aggressive move. The alpha did not correct it. That was the first sign. I did not know enough to read it then. Afterward, the xenobiologists told me that allowing a cub to approach a categorized threat, even allowing it to approach and investigate, is something a Veth'kai alpha does not do. Period. It is an absolute behavioral prohibition. They did not have a category for what the alpha had done. They put it in a file and argued about it for 6 months. The security team arrived at the junction door at 2:31. Two humans in contact suits, faces pale, hands at their sides in the posture of people who have evaluated every option and chosen very deliberately not to touch anything. They stopped in the doorway. They took in 7 Veth'kai adults, a sitting alpha, 1 maintenance technician on the floor, and 2 cubs in various states of distress arranged against said technician. One of them very quietly said, "Holt, are you all right?" I said, "I think so." He said, "Can you move?" I looked at the alpha. The alpha was still looking at me. I said, "I'd rather wait a minute." He said, "Okay." We waited. The interspecies liaison officer arrived at 2:44. Her name was Counselor Bria Vash, and she had been pulled from her off-rotation bunk and was still in the process of being fully awake when she appeared in the doorway. She took approximately 4 seconds to assess the room, which impressed me considerably. Then she crouched down at roughly the same level I was at, which was the correct instinct. She was reducing her profile, her apparent size, presenting herself as small, and she addressed the alpha in the Veth'kai formal contact register, which is a structured set of vocalization patterns that the compact had spent years developing. The alpha listened. Then the alpha did something Counselor Vash told me later she had never seen in 16 years of Veth'kai contact work. It responded. Not in the formal contact register. That register is a simplified system, a diplomatic pigeon, and the Veth'kai use it when they have chosen to engage with the compact framework, which they do when it suits them and ignore completely when it does not. The alpha's response was in natural Veth'kai vocalization, which Vash could only partly decode in real time. She caught fragments. She told me about those fragments later, in a briefing room on Meridian, with the full translation in front of her. The alpha said, "The small ones chose this den. The human in this den did not drive them out. It held the wound leg one in the way of pack kin." There is no precise translation for pack kin in any human language. The closest Vash could get was, "one of our own." The alpha said, "This human has the hands of a pack member." And then it said, and this is the part the xenobiologists argued about for 6 months, the part that ended up in 3 separate academic papers and a policy brief that went to the Compact Governing Council. It said something that translates to approximately, "We came for blood and found instead a keeping." A keeping has different rules. A keeping. The Veth'kai concept of a keeping is the act of deliberately tending something smaller than yourself at cost to yourself. It is what adults do for cubs. It is what older pack members do for injured younger ones. It is a behavior so freighted with pack significance that the Veth'kai language treats it as a categorical state rather than an action. You are not keeping. You are in keeping. You have entered a condition with specific obligations and specific protections attached. A human had entered keeping with Veth'kai cubs. This had never happened before. There was no protocol for it. There was no precedent. The alpha, facing a completely unprecedented situation, had done what alpha predators do when confronted with something genuinely outside the known categories. It sat down, it waited, it assessed until it had enough information to make a decision. And its decision was that the keeping had occurred, and therefore the rules of the keeping applied, and the rules of the keeping do not permit blood. The pack did not stand down immediately. They sat. They stayed in that junction, 7 adults and 3 cubs, for another 40 minutes while the counselor negotiated the handoff of the injured cubs to the station medical team. The alpha observed the medical team's initial examination of the cubs from 2 meters distance, filaments cooling gradually from orange to gray to something near a resting state. When the one with the leg wound was carried out on a medical litter, the alpha followed it to the medical bay entrance, confirmed the counselor's assurance that it would be permitted to enter and observe treatment, and then went in. The other one, the one I had been holding against my chest, they found the wound was deeper than I had estimated, and the pressure cloth had made a significant difference. The medical team lead told me later, in the tone of someone choosing words carefully, that the cub had been in enough distress that losing body heat would have been a serious complicating factor, and that whoever had thought to keep it warm had done the right thing. They let me stay for the transfer because the cub with the chest wound, when they tried to move it onto the medical litter, made a sound and tried to dig its small claws into my jacket. Not to hurt me. The opposite. And the alpha, watching from 2 meters away, did something with its filaments that the counselor said she had never seen an alpha do in a non-pack contact. It went dark. Not the dark of depletion, not the dim flicker of an exhausted young one. Fully dark. The deliberate dark. The filaments of a Veth'kai go completely dark in exactly one emotional state, which the compact's xenobiologists label ceremonially dim and which is, as close as anyone can translate it, the state of being moved by something you did not expect to be moved by. An apex predator, leader of a pack that had come down 7 decks in hunt mode to collect its young, stood in a medical junction and went dark. I stayed with the cub through the transfer, kept a hand on it, talked quietly the same nonsense I had been talking in the junction, until the medical team had it settled and sedated. Then I stepped back. The alpha stepped forward to take my place beside the litter. It did not look at me as it passed, but when it was past me and its flank was beside me, the filaments, coming back up from the dark slowly into a low blue, brushed my arm. It was not an accident. I know enough about Veth'kai physical communication now to know that filament contact is deliberate always. The alpha chose, as it passed me, to make contact. I do not know what that means precisely. The xenobiologists disagree. Counselor Vash said it was the closest the Veth'kai have to an acknowledgement elevated beyond acknowledged, a category that did not exist in the contact framework before that night. She said she was going to call it marked in her report, and that the governing council was going to have opinions about that term for a very long time. Both cubs recovered. The one with the leg wound needed surgical intervention to address the circulation damage fully, and spent 2 weeks in the station medical bay under round-the-clock Veth'kai supervision, which the station medical staff accepted with remarkable professionalism. The alpha stayed the entire time, or rotated another adult in when it had to attend to other matters. By the 2nd week, the medical staff was reporting that the cub had begun to accept examination with the adult present and calm, which represented a significant improvement over the initial contact conditions, which had been extremely challenging for everyone. I went back to work the next day. My supervisor, who had been informed of the events by station command, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "So I hear you sat on the floor of Junction 11 Foxtrot for an hour holding alien bear cubs." I said, "That's roughly accurate." He said, "And nobody's eating anyone." I said, "Everybody is fine." He nodded. He said, "Good. The Deck 7 scrubbers are running at 62%. I need you on that by noon." I said, "Understood." I do not tell this story to make a point about alien relations or interspecies diplomacy or the biology of pack behavior. I am a maintenance technician. I did not go into that junction with a theory. I went in with a torque wrench and a filtration housing, and I found something hurt on the floor. And I did what you do when you find something hurt on the floor, which is the same thing my father did and his mother before him. You get low, you move slow, you put your hands on the problem, and you try to make it less bad than it was when you found it. That is not a species trait. That is not an HFY angle. It is just what the decent ones among us do when given the chance. But I will say this, because it is true, and because I have thought about it in the 3 years since that night in ways I could not have predicted. The Veth'kai came down 7 decks in the dark, filaments running hot, looking for their young. They were ready to take apart anything between them and those cubs. They had the capability. They had the will. They were not wrong to have it. That is what you do when your young are missing and you do not know what has happened to them. You go. You go hard and you go ready and you do not stop until you have them back. And then they walked into a cold junction and found a human on the floor. Not a soldier, not a negotiator, not a diplomat with a prepared statement and a protocol. Just a man with a pressure cloth and a flathead driver and a cub against his chest, doing the thing that required no bravery and no greatness, only the specific unwillingness to step back from something small that was hurting. The alpha sat down. I think about the alpha sitting down. I think about what that required, what kind of certainty or uncertainty or willingness to hold a situation that had no category yet, while 7 adults behind it waited for a signal, and the signal did not come because the alpha was still processing something it did not have a prior word for. That is not weakness. That is a different kind of strength, the kind that does not get songs or monuments, the kind that looks like stillness from the outside and is a tremendous amount of work from the inside. We have more in common with the Veth'kai than the contact protocols suggest. I said this to a xenobiologist once, and he looked at me like I had made a category error. Maybe I had. Maybe I'm a maintenance technician, and I should limit my observations to filtration systems and conduit integrity, and leave the xenobiology to the people who studied for it. But I was in that room. I felt the alpha's filaments on my arm. I know what the dark means now. They came for blood. They found something they did not have a word for. They made a new word. So did we. I finished the filtration housing replacement on Deck 7 by 11:30 that morning. The scrubbers came back up to 91%, which was about as good as they were going to get given the age of the units. I logged the job, ate lunch in the canteen, and was back on my loop by 1300, a normal shift. 2 months later, Counselor Vash forwarded me a communication that had come through the Compact's formal channels from the Veth'kai pack. I say communication loosely. It was a scent-marked object, a fragment of a material I could not identify, forwarded as a digital representation, because obviously the original could not be transmitted through a relay. The formal notation that accompanied it said it was a pack token, which the contact framework notes as an object exchanged between pack members to represent a bond of mutual obligation. Packs exchange them. Pack members carry them. The notation said this was the first time in the documented history of compact Veth'kai contact that a pack token had been sent to a non-Veth'kai recipient. I asked Counselor Vash what I was supposed to do with it. She said, "I think you keep it." I said, "Do I need to do anything? Is there an obligation?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think the obligation is what you already did." The scent token is in a sealed case in my cabin on Deck 8, beside the coffee maker I have repaired 6 times. I do not know precisely what it means in Veth'kai terms, and I have read every paper the xenobiologists have published about it and remain uncertain. But I know what it felt like when the alpha's filaments brushed my arm in the medical junction at 300 on a Tuesday in October. That low, deliberate contact, filaments coming back from the dark, and I know that some things do not require a translation. They found their cubs alive. They went dark. That is the story.